A single confession shattered decades of silence out.
Yeah, and it freaked me out being surrounded.
Julian Lennon, the untold story behind the name. Most people know the name Lennon. They know the music, the legacy, the image of a man who sang about peace and love and changed the world forever. But very few people know what it was actually like to grow up as his son. At 62 years old, Julian Lennon said something that shocked a lot of people. He said, simply, that he truly hated her. Just a few words, but behind them sat a lifetime of pain, secrets, and emotions that had never really been spoken out loud before. This is the story of what really happened inside one of the most famous families in music history, and it is not the story you think you know. Julian Lennon was not born into happiness. He was born into a name, and there is a big difference. From the outside, being the son of John Lennon must have seemed like winning the lottery. People assumed his childhood was filled with glamour and comfort and all the wonderful things that come with being connected to one of the most famous musicians who ever lived. But that assumption could not have been more wrong. Inside the walls of that home, happiness was not something that came easily or stayed for long. When John Lennon walked on his family, Julian was still just a small boy. There was no long conversation, no gentle explanation, no real goodbye. John simply left, moving on to another woman, leaving Julian and his mother, Cynthia, behind, in silence and confusion. Cynthia was left to pick up the pieces entirely on her own. She sold off family belongings just to make sure there was food on the table. The image of rock royalty quickly faded into the reality of a small flat, second-hand clothes, and the constant worry of not knowing what the next day would bring. The fairy tale was over before Julian was old enough to understand what had happened. If you are new here, this channel is where we go beyond the headlines and dig into the real stories behind the biggest names in entertainment, stories that rarely get told the way they actually happened. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit subscribe right now so you never miss one. Now, let's get back to Julian. Growing up, Julian found that his famous last name did not protect him. If anything, it made things harder. At school, other kids saw the name Lennon and assumed he had everything. They could not see the emptiness he carried around every single day. Instead of being admired, he was mocked and bullied. Kids would hide his things, say cruel words, make his life difficult. And the teachers, perhaps assuming that the son of a superstar had no real problems worth addressing, mostly looked the other way. Julian had no one standing up for him except his mother. Cynthia worked tirelessly to be his shield, to build some kind of wall between her son and the harshness of the world outside, but she could only do so much. What made everything harder was the image of his father that surrounded Julian everywhere he went. John Lennon was on posters, his songs played on every radio station. People spoke about him like he was a saint, a prophet of peace, a man who had dedicated his life to love and unity. Julian heard those words and felt something very different from what everyone else felt. To the world, John Lennon was an icon. To Julian, he was the man who had walked away. The same voice that sang about imagining a world of peace was the voice that had gone quiet in Julian's life, and that contradiction lived inside him every single day. The pain grew sharper as Julian got older and began to see how differently his father treated his younger half-brother, Sean, who was John's son with Yoko Ono. The media painted John as a devoted and loving father during those years. Stories came out about how he had stepped back from music to raise Sean, to be present, to be the father he wanted to be. For Julian, reading and hearing those stories felt like being punched over and over again. He had never had that version of his father. He had never had the warmth, the time, the attention, the simple act of being seen. There were rumors, painful ones, that John had once referred to Julian as a mistake, while Sean was described as the child born out of love. Whether those words were ever truly spoken that way or not almost doesn't matter. The damage they did was real, and the scars they left behind lasted for decades. Julian tried to hold on to whatever small pieces of connection he could find. There were occasional phone calls, there were a handful of meetings that felt awkward and forced rather than warm and natural. Sometimes a small gift would arrive, a guitar here, a kind word there, and Julian would allow himself to feel something like hope, but that hope was always short-lived. The silence would return, stretching out for months and years, and Julian would be left once again wondering why he was not enough. Eventually, the hoping became too painful, and he taught himself to stop expecting anything at all. He built walls around himself, layers of protection made from years of disappointment, and he learned to carry his pain quietly rather than let the world see it.
Then came the day that changed everything. Not just for Julian, but for the entire world. John Lennon was shot and killed. The news sent millions of people into a state of grief that was unlike anything seen before. Fans gathered in Central Park. Radio stations played his music on repeat. World leaders made statements. The outpouring was enormous and genuine. But Julian's grief existed in a completely different space from all of that. In the days just before his father died, Julian had actually spoken to him. He had sensed something warmer than usual in his father's voice, something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like the beginning of something real. That small, fragile moment of possibility, the sense that maybe things could finally be different between them, was gone in an instant. There was no funeral for Julian to attend, no public ceremony where he could grieve alongside others. Yoko Ono announced that there would be no memorial service, only a request that people honored John's message of peace. Julian was left completely alone with his grief, surrounded by memories and regret and the echo of the last words his father had said to him. While the whole world mourned a legend, Julian mourned the father he had never really been allowed to have. And the sharpest pain came shortly after, when John's will was read. Almost everything had been left to Yoko and Sean. Julian, the firstborn son, was barely mentioned. A small trust fund was set aside for him, a cold and minimal gesture that felt less like love and more like an afterthought. For Julian, this was not really about money. It was about being erased. It was about looking at a document that was supposed to represent his father's final wishes and finding himself almost completely absent from it. Julian made the decision to fight back. He launched a long legal battle that went on for years, involving difficult negotiations, sleepless nights, and constant media attention. The tabloids painted him as greedy, as a son trying to cash in on his father's fame, but that was never what it was about for Julian. He was fighting for recognition. He was fighting to be acknowledged as a real part of his father's story, not edited out of it. The eventual settlement was reportedly significant in financial terms, but no amount of money could touch the real wound underneath. Some things cannot be compensated for. Running alongside the legal battle was the ongoing conflict with Yoko Ono. She controlled everything: the estate, the music, the narrative, the entire public legacy of John Lennon passed through her hands. Every time Julian and Yoko were in the same room, it was a performance. Smiles that did not reach the eyes, polite words covering years of resentment. Yoko represented, in Julian's mind, the moment everything fell apart. She was the woman his father had chosen over his family. She was the one who held the keys to everything Julian felt should have been his, not just financially, but symbolically. For nearly 2 decades, every interaction between them was a reminder of how much he had lost and how little power he had over his own story. But time is a strange thing. Anger, if you carry it long enough, starts to become exhausting. Julian began to notice, slowly and gradually, that the bitterness was costing him more than it was costing anyone else. There were small moments that began to chip away at the hard shell he had built up. A photography exhibition brought him a new sense of identity and purpose. Unexpected encounters reminded him that not everything had to be a battle. And above all, his relationship with his brother Sean began to change everything. Sean and Julian had grown up in entirely different worlds. Sean had the father Julian always wanted. Sean had the attention, the love, the presence. Julian had watched from a distance for years, and jealousy had made real closeness nearly impossible. But as adults, something shifted. They began to talk honestly. They found shared experiences and a shared understanding of what it meant to grow up under the weight of one of the most famous names in the world. Sean showed Julian a genuine kindness and acceptance that slowly began to dismantle the walls between them. In Sean, Julian found something he had been searching for his entire life, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with fame or money or legacy. It was simply two brothers finding each other after a long time apart. That bond with Sean helped Julian make peace with something he had been fighting for decades. He chose, not dramatically or all at once, but quietly and steadily, to stop fighting Yoko. Not because everything was suddenly forgiven or forgotten, but because holding on to the anger was no longer worth what it was taking from him. The choice was not for her sake, it was for his own. It was a decision to protect what he had found with Sean and to stop letting the past own his present.
Building his own identity separate from his father's name was its own long journey. Wherever Julian went, people saw John Lennon first. Every song he wrote, every interview he gave, every public appearance he made was immediately filtered through the lens of his father. People did not want a new artist. They wanted a continuation of a legend. And Julian was not that, nor did he want to be. So rather than keep chasing an approval that would always be shaped by someone else's expectations, he turned toward things that were entirely his own. Photography became a serious passion and eventually a real body of work. Personal projects, writing, creative endeavors that had nothing to do with music or the Lennon name gave him back a sense of self that the world had been trying to take from him since childhood. He stopped running from his father's shadow and found a different way to relate to it. Instead of feeling crushed by the legacy, he began to carry it with a quiet and honest pride, not pretending that everything was fine, not rewriting the painful parts, but acknowledging where he came from while insisting on being fully himself. The name Lennon, which had once felt like a cage, became something he could hold without letting it define every single thing about who he was. When Julian said at 62 that he truly hated her, those words carried everything we have just talked about. Decades of loss, of feeling invisible, of watching the world celebrate a man he had barely known. The grief of a boy who waited for his father and kept being disappointed. The anger of a young man who fought to be seen. The exhaustion of someone who spent years carrying a pain they never asked for. But here is the thing about Julian Lennon's story. It does not end in bitterness. It ends in something much quieter and much harder to achieve than bitterness. It ends in a kind of peace. Not the easy, comfortable peace of someone who was never really hurt, but the hard-won, honest, imperfect peace of someone who looked at everything that happened to them and decided, slowly and with great difficulty, to keep living and keep creating anyway. His story holds up a mirror to something a lot of people can recognize, even if their own lives have nothing to do with fame or rock and roll. The experience of growing up feeling unwanted, the complicated grief of losing someone you never fully had, the long, slow work of building an identity that belongs to you and not to other people's expectations. The decision to let go of anger, not because the anger was unjustified, but because holding on to it was too great a cost. Julian Lennon was never given the father he deserved. He was never given the recognition he deserved. He fought hard for both and found, in the end, that neither could give him what he was really looking for. What finally brought him peace was something much simpler and much more real. A brother who accepted him, a creative life that was genuinely his, and the quiet, courageous decision to stop letting the past write his future. That is the real story of Julian Lennon, and it is one worth knowing. If this story stayed with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We are here every week with more real stories from behind the curtain of fame, the ones that rarely get told and almost never get told this honestly. Thank you for watching.